November 20th, 1917, 6:20 a.m., the Hindenburg Line near Cambrai, France. Hauptmann Klaus Müller of the 54th Infantry Division pressed himself against the frozen wall of his concrete bunker, coffee forgotten, as an unprecedented sound rolled across the pre-dawn darkness. Not the familiar thunder of artillery preparation that had preceded every British attack for 3 years, but something else, something mechanical, something massive. Through the observation slit he could see nothing but the artificial fog created by British smoke shells, a standard tactic. But that sound, hundreds of engines, deep and guttural, growing louder. Then the ground began to shake. Müller had been on the Western Front since 1914. He had survived the Marne, Ypres, Verdun and the Somme. He had seen every horror industrial warfare could produce. But nothing in 3 years of mechanized slaughter had prepared him for what emerged from that smoke at 6:20 a.m. on November 20th, 1917. 476 British tanks, advancing in line abreast across a 6-mile front, crushing the wire that had stopped every previous offensive, bridging the trenches that had defined the war, and smashing through defences that German High Command had declared impenetrable. What Müller and thousands of German soldiers witnessed that morning was the complete invalidation of 3 years of tactical doctrine, the destruction of defensive systems that had cost millions of lives to construct, and the arrival of a weapon that would fundamentally transform warfare. Within 8 hours, British forces would penetrate further into German lines than any offensive since 1914, advancing over 4 miles in a single day. Not 400 yards, not 4,000 yards, 4 miles. The breakthrough that had eluded millions of men and thousands of guns was achieved by tracked machines that German generals had dismissed as curiosities, mechanical toys that would never influence the outcome of modern war. This is the story of how tanks went from laughingstock to war winner, how German military orthodoxy blinded brilliant commanders to revolutionary change, and how one November morning shattered 3 years of strategic certainty. The story begins not at Cambrai, but in the mind of a British colonel who understood that the stalemate of trench warfare demanded a revolutionary solution. Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Swinton, serving with the Royal Engineers in France, watched the slaughter of 1915 with growing horror. Every offensive followed the same pattern: artillery bombardment, infantry assault, German machine gun fire, mass casualties, minimal gains. The mathematics of death were simple and unchanging. The defence had overwhelming advantages. Machine guns could fire 600 rounds per minute. Barbed wire arranged in belts 30 yards deep funneled attacking infantry into kill zones. Concrete bunkers provided protection from all but direct hits. Trenches, mutually supporting and multiply redundant, meant that capturing one position meant nothing if the next line remained intact. Artillery could destroy trenches but couldn't destroy wire effectively. The bombardments turned the ground into cratered moonscapes that stopped advancing infantry more effectively than any defensive obstacle. Swinton, obsessing over this problem through the winter of 1915, had a revelation. The solution wasn't better artillery or braver infantry. The solution was a machine that could cross trenches, crush wire, survive machine gun fire, and deliver firepower directly to German positions. A tracked armoured vehicle mounting cannon. He wasn't the first to conceive the idea. Various inventors had proposed armoured vehicles, but Swinton understood the specific tactical problem. The machine needed to cross an 8-foot trench, climb a 4-foot vertical obstacle, crush 30 yards of wire, survive armour-piercing bullets, and carry sufficient firepower to destroy bunkers. In February 1915, Swinton submitted his proposal to the War Office. The response was immediate and dismissive. General Staff officers, trained in cavalry tactics and infantry doctrine, saw no place for tracked vehicles in modern war. The Director of Artillery dismissed it as a pretty mechanical toy. The Director of Fortifications declared it technically impossible. The cavalry establishment, still dreaming of breakthrough and exploitation by mounted troops, viewed it as a threat to their relevance. But Swinton found an unexpected ally. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, possessed both the imagination to grasp the concept and the authority to fund development. In February 1915, Churchill established the Landships Committee, deliberately using naval terminology to maintain secrecy and keep the project under Admiralty control, away from hostile army officers. The prototype, dubbed Little Willie, ran its first trials in September 1915. It could cross trenches, climb obstacles, and survive small arms fire. But it was too slow, too unreliable, and too lightly armed. The second prototype, Mother, featured the distinctive rhomboid shape that would characterize British heavy tanks. The tracks ran around the entire hull, giving it the ability to cross wider trenches. Sponsons on each side mounted naval 6-pounder guns. Armour plate 12mm thick could stop armour-piercing rifle bullets. At 28 tons, it was the heaviest fighting vehicle ever built. The first demonstration for military officials took place in February 1916. Field Marshal Haig, commanding British forces in France, watched Mother lumber across Hatfield Park, crushing wire obstacles, crossing trenches, and engaging targets with its sponson-mounted guns. Unlike many senior officers, Haig immediately grasped the potential. He ordered 100 tanks before the design was even finalised. The production contract was signed on February 12, 1916. But maintaining secrecy required deception. Workers were told they were building water carriers for Mesopotamia. The large rectangular structures were described as tanks for water transport. The name stuck. The British Army's revolutionary weapon would be called the tank, a name deliberately chosen to confuse German intelligence. By September 1916, 49 tanks were ready for combat. Haig, desperate for any advantage in the Somme offensive, ordered them committed to battle despite their incomplete training and untested reliability. On September 15, 1916, tanks entered combat for the first time at Flers-Courcelette. Of 49 tanks committed, 17 reached German lines. The rest broke down, ditched in shell craters, or were disabled by artillery fire. But those 17 tanks accomplished something unprecedented. They crossed no man's land, survived machine gun fire, crushed wire obstacles, and directly engaged German positions. One tank advanced through Flers village with British infantry following behind, sheltering from German fire in the vehicle's wake. A Royal Flying Corps observer reported a tank is walking up the high street of Flers, with the British Army cheering behind. German troops, seeing tanks for the first time, reacted with confusion and terror. Soldiers who had held their positions against massed infantry attacks abandoned them at the sight of these iron monsters. Officers reported men fleeing in panic, refusing orders to return to positions where tanks might appear. The psychological impact was profound, but the tactical results were mixed. Tanks had proven they could break through, but their mechanical unreliability and vulnerability to artillery meant they couldn't sustain operations. German High Command, receiving reports of the new British weapon, conducted immediate analysis. The assessment, delivered to General Ludendorff in October 1916, was dismissive. Tanks represented an interesting experiment but possessed fundamental flaws that made them unsuitable for decisive operations. The German analysis identified real problems. Tanks were mechanically unreliable, averaging less than 20 miles before breakdown. They were slow, maximum speed 6 km per hour, making them vulnerable to artillery. Their armour, while proof against rifle fire, could be penetrated by armour-piercing bullets at close range. Their operational radius was limited to a few kilometres by fuel consumption. Their crews suffered extreme conditions, heat, carbon monoxide poisoning, and noise that made communication impossible. Most significantly, the German analysts concluded that tanks could never operate independently. They required infantry support to suppress anti-tank weapons. They needed artillery to suppress anti-tank guns. They needed engineers to prepare routes through obstacles. In German military thinking, tanks were a supporting weapon, possibly useful for assisting infantry attacks, but incapable of independent operations or strategic effect. This assessment was reinforced by subsequent British tank attacks. At Arras in April 1917, 60 tanks attacked in snow, denure, and mud. Most bogged down or broke down. At Third Ypres in August 1917, tanks attempting to operate in the flooded Flanders mud were catastrophically ineffective. Of 216 tanks committed, 187 were disabled by ground conditions before engaging the enemy. German officers observing these failures had their prejudices confirmed. Tanks were weather-dependent, terrain-dependent, and tactically inflexible. Competent defensive systems, properly warned and prepared, could neutralise them. Anti-tank rifles, artillery firing over open sites, and field guns positioned for direct fire could destroy tanks before they reached German lines. The conclusion was clear. Tanks were a gimmick, a desperate British experiment that had failed to break the stalemate. General Erich Ludendorff, effective commander of German forces, made the definitive statement in August 1917. The tank has not altered the fundamental nature of warfare. It remains a supporting weapon of limited utility, unable to achieve decisive results against prepared defences. Our resources are better invested in artillery, machine guns, and the training of stormtroop tactics. Germany's decision to deprioritise tank development was not entirely irrational. They faced resource constraints that Britain did not. Every ton of steel allocated to tank production was steel not available for submarines, artillery, or ammunition. The German economy, strangled by blockade, couldn't afford expensive experiments with unproven weapons. Moreover, Germany's strategic position was defensive. They held favourable ground, possessed prepared positions, and needed only to avoid defeat until U-boat warfare forced Britain to negotiate. Offensive weapons like tanks seemed less relevant than defensive systems. But this analysis contained a fatal assumption. It assumed that tanks would be employed the same way in future as they had been in the past. It assumed British tactical doctrine would remain static. It assumed mechanical reliability couldn't be improved. It assumed combined arms integration wouldn't evolve. Most dangerously, it assumed that German defensive doctrine, predicated on machine guns, wire and trenches, would remain effective against any attack. While German High Command dismissed tanks, British officers were learning. Colonel John Fuller, Chief of Staff of the Tank Corps, and Brigadier General Hugh Ells, commanding the Tank Corps, studied every action meticulously. They identified the failures not as evidence tanks were useless, but as evidence tanks were being misused. The key problems were terrain, preparation and integration. Tanks bogged down in mud, so they needed firm ground. Tanks broke through but couldn't hold ground without infantry, so combined arms tactics needed refinement. Tanks were vulnerable to artillery if detected early, so surprise was essential. By autumn 1917, Fuller and Ellis had developed a revolutionary tactical concept. Tanks would not support infantry attacks. Infantry would support tank attacks. Instead of the traditional prolonged artillery bombardment that destroyed surprise and churned the ground into impassable mud, the attack would begin with tanks advancing behind a hurricane bombardment that would lift the moment tanks crossed the start line. Tanks would cross no man's land, breach the wire, cross the trenches, and suppress German positions while infantry advanced in their wake, consolidating each position before moving forward. The critical innovation was selecting terrain suitable for tanks. The Cambrai sector possessed exactly what Fuller needed. The ground was firm chalk, free from the mud that had doomed tanks at Ypres. The terrain was rolling and open, ideal for mass tank operations. The German defences, while formidable, relied on wire and trenches rather than natural obstacles. Most importantly, the Cambrai sector was quiet. German forces considered it a rest area for divisions exhausted by Flanders fighting. They expected no major operations before spring 1918. Fuller's plan called for 476 tanks attacking on a 6-mile front with minimal artillery preparation. The tanks would be organised in sections of 3. The lead tank crushing wire and crossing the first trench, followed by 2 tanks that would turn parallel to the trench and engage it with machine gun and cannon fire while infantry cleared it. Each section would advance to the next trench line and repeat the process. 6 infantry divisions and 5 cavalry divisions would follow through the breach, exploiting deep into the German rear. The objective was not attrition but breakthrough, a decisive penetration that would restore mobile warfare and potentially end the stalemate. Field Marshal Haig, desperate for a victory after the disasters of 3rd Ypres, approved the plan with modifications. The attack would occur on November 20, 1917. Secrecy would be absolute. Tanks would move into position only at the last moment, their engine noise covered by low-flying aircraft. There would be no preliminary bombardment, no warning, no time for German reserves to deploy. Across from the British preparations, German forces in the Cambrai sector settled into winter routine. The 54th Infantry Division held a section of the Hindenburg Line, a defensive system considered the strongest ever constructed. The Hindenburg Line wasn't a line, but a zone, 6 miles deep, consisting of multiple trench systems, concrete bunkers, artillery positions, and obstacles. The forward zone featured wire obstacles 30 yards deep, multiple trench lines with concrete machine gun posts, and observation posts with excellent fields of fire. The support zone, 2,000 yards behind the front, contained reserve positions and artillery. The rear zone, another 2,000 yards back, held additional reserves and supply dumps. The system was designed to absorb attacks. Even if the British broke through the forward zone, they would face fresh defences manned by reserves. Counterattack. Divisions, positioned further back, would seal any breach before exploitation occurred. German intelligence detected no signs of unusual activity. Aerial reconnaissance showed normal British positions. Signal intercepts revealed no increase in radio traffic. Prisoner interrogations provided no warnings. The absence of the usual massive artillery build-up confirmed that no major attack was imminent. German troops on November 19, 1917, expected another quiet day on a quiet front. Hauptmann Müller, commanding a bunker in the forward line, spent the evening of November 19 writing letters, confident that his sector would see no action before spring. His bunker was modern and comfortable by Western Front standards, concrete walls 3 feet thick, gas-proof doors, electric lighting, bunks for the 30-man garrison. Outside, wire obstacles stretched in belts 30 yards deep. Machine gun positions were sited with overlapping fields of fire. The trenches were deep, well-drained, and multiply revetted. It was, in German professional opinion, impregnable. At 6:10 a.m. on November 20, 1917, British artillery opened fire along the Cambrai front. But this wasn't the traditional bombardment. Instead of days of sustained fire that warned defenders and destroyed the ground, this was a hurricane barrage, 1,000 guns firing for exactly 10 minutes on precisely identified targets. High explosive shells hit German artillery positions, suppressing counter-battery fire. Smoke shells created artificial fog across no man's land. Gas shells targeted German command posts and communication centres. At 6:20 a.m., the barrage lifted and shifted to German rear areas. In the sudden relative silence, German soldiers in forward positions heard that sound. Engines. Hundreds of engines. The fog created by smoke shells was still too thick to see through, but the ground shook with the vibration of approaching vehicles. Machine gunners at their posts peering into the smoke waited for the familiar sight of British infantry advancing in waves. Instead, at 6:22 a.m., massive shapes emerged from the fog. Tanks, not the handful that had appeared at previous battles, but hundreds of them, advancing in line abreast across the entire front. Each tank pulled a massive fascine, a bundle of wood 8 feet in diameter that would be dropped into trenches to create a bridge. The German response was immediate confusion. Machine gunners opened fire, their bullets sparking harmlessly off armour plate. Officers ordered artillery support, but the communication lines had been cut by the opening barrage. The wire obstacles that had stopped every previous British attack were simply crushed. The tanks rolled over the wire, their tracks pressing it flat into the mud, creating lanes through which infantry could follow. The first tank reached Müller's position at 6:24 a.m., 4 minutes after crossing the start line. Müller watched in horrified fascination as the tank approached his bunker, its tracks throwing up, mud, its engine roaring, its 6-pounder gun firing at point-blank range into German positions. The tank dropped its fascine into the trench in front of the bunker, crossed the trench, and turned parallel to it. A second tank followed, stopping next to the filled trench and firing its machine guns along the trench line, suppressing any resistance. British infantry, advancing behind the tanks, reached the trench within minutes, finding German defenders stunned, disoriented, and in many cases fleeing toward the rear. Müller's bunker, designed to withstand artillery, was useless against tanks. The 6-pounder guns, firing at ranges of 50 yards, could penetrate the embrasures. The British infantry, sheltered by the tanks, could approach close enough to throw grenades through the firing slits. Within 10 minutes of the attack beginning, Müller's bunker was neutralised, his men surrendering or dead. This scene repeated across the entire 6-mile front. The German forward zone, considered impregnable, was overrun in less than an hour. The tanks simply bypassed strong points, leaving them for following infantry while pressing on to the next defensive line. By 8 a.m., less than 2 hours after the attack began, British forces had penetrated 3 miles into German positions. The Hindenburg Line, which had stopped every previous attack, had been breached along its entire depth. German reserves, positioned to counterattack any penetration, found themselves facing an entirely new tactical situation. Previous British breakthroughs, achieved at enormous cost and after days of warning, created narrow salients that could be sealed and counterattacked. The Cambrai breakthrough was broad, deep, and still expanding. German officers, trained in counterattack doctrine, attempted to organise responses, but the counterattack units designed to seal breaches found themselves engaging tanks, a situation for which they had no training, no appropriate weapons, and no tactical doctrine. Lieutenant Hans Weber, leading a counterattack company toward a reported British penetration near Ribecourt, encountered British tanks at 9:30 a.m. His after-action report, written 3 days later from a field hospital, described the impossible tactical situation. We advanced in skirmish line toward the sound of firing, expecting to engage British infantry who had broken through. Instead, we saw tanks, 6 or 7 of them, advancing across open ground. I ordered my men to take cover and engage with rifles. Our fire had no effect. The tanks continued toward us. I ordered withdrawal to better positions. The tanks followed. We attempted to establish a defensive line in a sunken road, but the tanks simply crossed it. 3 of them passed within 50 meters of my position. The noise was overwhelming. The machines were massive, far larger than I had imagined from intelligence descriptions. Our rifle fire was completely ineffective. One of my sergeants attempted to engage a tank with a grenade, approaching to throwing distance. He was killed by machine gun fire before he could throw. I ordered full retreat. We fell back over 1,000 meters before establishing contact with other units. My company of 120 men suffered 47 casualties, most during the retreat under fire from tank-mounted machine guns. We destroyed no tanks. We delayed them not at all. By noon on November 20th, British forces had advanced over 4 miles on a 6-mile front, captured 7,500 German prisoners, seized 120 artillery pieces, and penetrated further in 6 hours than any offensive since 1914 had achieved in months. The cost was astonishingly low by Western Front standards. British casualties for November the 20th were under 4,000 men, a fraction of the losses in comparable operations. Tank losses were significant, 65 destroyed or disabled, but these were mechanical failures rather than enemy action. German defensive doctrine had simply collapsed. The entire tactical system, machine guns, wire, trenches, artillery, had been optimized to stop infantry attacks. Against massed tanks supported by infantry, it was useless. German High Command, receiving reports of the disaster throughout November 20th, initially refused to believe them. The reports claimed British penetrations of 4 miles in a single day, casualties of 10,000 men with minimal British losses, the entire Hindenburg line breached. It was impossible. Defences that strong couldn't collapse that quickly. General Georg von der Marwitz, commanding the German Second Army responsible for the Cambrai sector, reported to Ludendorff at 3 p.m. on November the 20th. The reports are confirmed. The British have achieved a major breakthrough using mass tank formations. Our forward defences were completely overrun. The Hindenburg line is breached along a 6-mile front to a depth of 4 miles. Current British positions are beyond our prepared defences. Reserve divisions are moving forward, but are encountering British tanks and suffering severe casualties. We require immediate reinforcements and anti-tank weapons. Ludendorff's response revealed both his tactical flexibility and his continued underestimation of tanks. He ordered 6 divisions transferred to Cambrai immediately, prioritising experienced storm troops trained in counterattack operations. He ordered all available artillery moved to seal the breakthrough. He ordered the creation of specialised anti-tank units, equipped with armour-piercing ammunition and field guns for direct fire. But his orders also revealed his assumption that this was a temporary crisis, not a revolution in warfare. The anti-tank measures were improvised and inadequate. The field guns positioned for direct fire against tanks were vulnerable to British artillery. The armour-piercing ammunition was in limited supply. The specialised anti-tank units didn't exist, and would take weeks to organise and train. Most tellingly, Ludendorff ordered no acceleration of German tank development. In his assessment, the British had achieved surprise and favourable conditions, but tanks remained fundamentally limited weapons that couldn't sustain operations or achieve strategic results. What Ludendorff didn't fully grasp was that Cambrai represented not just a tactical success, but a preview of future warfare. The combination of tanks, infantry, artillery and aircraft operating in coordination had broken through defences considered impregnable. The psychological impact on German troops was profound and lasting. Private Friedrich Meinert, an infantry soldier who faced British tanks on November the 20th, wrote in his diary, "I have been in battle many times. I fought at Verdun. I survived the Somme. I have seen men torn apart by shells, burned by gas, buried alive by bombardment. Nothing I have experienced prepared me for the tanks. When they emerged from the fog, massive and unstoppable, I felt fear unlike anything before. Our bullets bounced off them. Our officers had no orders, no tactics to deal with them. Men who had stood firm against infantry attacks fled in panic. I am not ashamed to admit I fled as well. How do you fight something that cannot be hurt, that crushes everything in its path, that keeps coming no matter what you do? The British exploitation of their breakthrough revealed the limitations that German analysts had identified. By November 21st, the attack had slowed. Tanks had outrun their supply lines and were running out of fuel and ammunition. Mechanical breakdowns had reduced the available tank force by half. The cavalry divisions intended to exploit the breakthrough found that German resistance, while shattered in the forward zone, remained strong in depth. Most critically, the British lacked sufficient reserves to exploit the gap they had created. The breakthrough was real, but it couldn't be sustained. By November 23rd, the advance had stalled. British forces had captured significant territory, but hadn't achieved the decisive breakthrough that Fuller and Ehlers had envisioned. German reserves were arriving, organising new defensive lines, and beginning limited counterattacks. On November 30th, German forces launched a massive counter-offensive using infiltration tactics developed on the Eastern Front. Without adequate tank support, British forces were pushed back, surrendering much of their gains. By December 5th, the front had stabilised with both sides holding minimal gains. German High Command interpreted Cambrai as confirming their assessment. Tanks had achieved initial surprise but had failed to deliver decisive results. The counter-offensive had recaptured most lost ground using traditional infantry tactics. The conclusion seemed obvious. Tanks were useful for breaking through prepared defences under favourable conditions, but they couldn't sustain operations or resist determined counterattacks. This interpretation was fatally flawed. It focused on the operational outcome, the ultimate failure to achieve breakthrough, while missing the tactical revelation. For the first time in 3 years, prepared defences had been breached quickly, cheaply, and completely. The Hindenburg Line, which had seemed impregnable, had been penetrated in hours. The psychological impact on German soldiers had been profound. If tanks could breach the strongest defences Germany could construct, what defences could stop them? The British learned different lessons. The Tank Corps analysed Cambrai meticulously, identifying problems and solutions. Mechanical reliability needed improvement. Supply systems needed to keep pace with advancing tanks. Infantry tank cooperation needed refinement. Most importantly, tanks needed to be concentrated, not dispersed, and employed with surprise, not after prolonged bombardment. In December 1917, Colonel Fuller submitted a memorandum that would influence tank development for decades. The tank must be considered not as an adjunct to infantry, but as a weapon in its own right, capable of independent operations. Future tank designs must prioritise reliability, mobility, and firepower. Tactics must be developed to exploit the tank's ability to break through and maintain momentum. The combination of tanks, aircraft, and motorised infantry will restore mobile warfare. Germany, meanwhile, continued its minimal investment in tank development. The A7V, Germany's only tank designed to see production, was an afterthought. Only 20 were built during the entire war. Weighing 30 tons, powered by 2 truck engines with a crew of 18, the A7V was mechanically unreliable and tactically inflexible. Its high profile and poor cross-country ability made it vulnerable. German tank crews, poorly trained and equipped with inadequate machines, achieved little. The contrast with British production was stark. By March 1918, Britain had over 1,000 tanks available. The new Markwaffen incorporated lessons from Cambrai, including improved engines, better transmission, and the ability to be controlled by one driver instead of 4 crew members. Production was accelerating, with plans for 4,000 tanks by the end of 1918. When Germany launched its spring offensive in March 1918, a last desperate attempt to win the war before American forces arrived in strength, tanks played no role in German planning. The offensive relied on infiltration tactics, artillery, and infantry. The initial attacks achieved spectacular success, breaking through Allied lines and advancing up to 40 miles in some sectors. But without tanks to exploit breakthroughs and suppress defensive positions, the offensive stalled. German storm troops advancing on foot couldn't maintain momentum against defending forces with motorised transport. By July 1918, the German offensive had failed, exhausting Germany's reserves and creating vulnerable salients. The Allied counter-offensive, beginning on August 8, 1918, demonstrated how far tank warfare had evolved. At the Battle of Amiens, 414 British tanks, 72 French tanks, and supporting forces attacked German positions without preliminary bombardment. The attack achieved complete surprise. German forces, exhausted from their own offensive and facing massed tanks supported by aircraft, collapsed. In one day, Allied forces advanced 8 miles, captured 16,000 prisoners, and captured or destroyed over 400 German artillery pieces. Ludendorff called it the Black Day of the German army. The German units engaged at Amiens included veterans who had stopped British attacks at Ypres, held at Verdun, and launched the spring offensive. Their collapse in the face of massed tank attacks revealed that German defensive doctrine had no answer to properly employed armour. Between August 8th and November 11th, 1918, British tanks participated in continuous offensive operations. The 100 Days Offensive saw tanks used not as breakthrough weapons, but as mobile fire support, advancing with infantry, suppressing strong points, and maintaining momentum. German resistance, formidable when facing unsupported infantry, crumbled when facing combined arms attacks. The psychological impact was overwhelming. German soldiers, ordered to hold positions against tank attacks, increasingly refused. Reports of tanks approaching triggered panic and mass surrenders. Units that had fought tenaciously for years abandoned positions at the first sign of British armour. Hauptmann Müller, who had survived Cambrai and continued fighting through 1918, encountered British tanks again during the 100 Days Offensive. His final diary entry, written 3 days before the armistice, captured the complete reversal in attitudes. We are finished, not because we lack courage or determination, but because we cannot fight what we cannot stop. The British tanks come every day now. Our anti-tank rifles are useless. Our artillery is suppressed or destroyed. Our infantry, exhausted and outnumbered, faces an enemy that can advance under armour, immune to our machine guns, crushing our defences. I mocked the tanks at Cambrai, called them mechanical toys. I was wrong. They are the weapon that won the war. In November 1918, as Germany signed the armistice, the statistics of tank effectiveness were undeniable. British tanks had participated in every major offensive since Cambrai. They had been instrumental in breaking through German defences repeatedly. They had inflicted casualties vastly disproportionate to their own losses. Most importantly, they had destroyed the psychological foundation of German defensive doctrine. The post-war analysis conducted by the German army identified tank warfare as one of the critical factors in Germany's defeat. The report noted that German dismissal of tanks in 1916 and 1917, while seemingly justified by early tank performance, had been a strategic error. The failure to develop countermeasures, invest in German tank production, and revise defensive doctrine to account for mass tank attacks had left German forces vulnerable to a weapon they couldn't effectively counter. The British Army's official history of the tank in World War I concluded that tanks had transformed from experimental curiosity to war-winning weapon in less than 3 years. The lessons learned at enormous cost, mechanical reliability, combined arms integration, concentration of force, and tactical surprise would shape armoured warfare for decades. General Ludendorff, in his memoirs published in 1919, admitted the strategic implications of Cambrai and subsequent tank battles. We underestimated the tank. We saw initial failures and concluded the weapon was fundamentally flawed. We failed to appreciate that the British were learning, improving both the machines and the tactics. By the time we recognised the threat, it was too late. We lacked the industrial capacity to produce tanks in necessary numbers. We lacked the tactical doctrine to employ them effectively. We lacked the operational experience to counter them. The tank did not win the war alone, but it made victory possible. The impact of tanks on military thinking extended far beyond World War I. The German officers who had experienced tank warfare firsthand, including future Wehrmacht leaders like Heinz Guderian, understood that armoured warfare would dominate future conflicts. The irony was profound. Germany, which had dismissed tanks as impractical in 1917, would develop the most sophisticated tank doctrine of World War II. The blitzkrieg tactics that devastated Poland and France in 1939 and 1940 were direct descendants of the tactics developed by Fuller and British tank commanders in 1917 and 1918. The Battle of Cambrai specifically influenced German military thinking. Guderian, in his book Achtung Panzer, published in 1937, cited Cambrai as proof that massed tank formations, employed with surprise and supported by combined arms, could achieve decisive breakthrough. The tactics he developed for German panzer divisions incorporated lessons the British had learned at Cambrai. Use tanks en masse, not dispersed. Achieve surprise through rapid concentration. Coordinate with aircraft and motorized infantry. Maintain momentum through deep penetration. The German tanks that shocked the world in 1940 were the descendants of the British tanks that German generals had mocked in 1917. The tactical doctrine that enabled German victories was based on British innovations that German commanders had dismissed as gimmicks. The weapon they had called impractical became the foundation of German military success. In 1940, British and French forces, facing German tanks employing tactics developed from Cambrai, experienced the same shock and psychological collapse that German forces had felt in 1917. The roles had reversed, but the lesson remained. Tanks, properly employed, could shatter defensive systems and create psychological effects that transcended their material capabilities. The story of Cambrai is often told as a near success, a battle that almost achieved breakthrough but ultimately failed. This interpretation misses the revolutionary nature of what occurred on November 20th, 1917. For the first time, industrial technology had solved the tactical problem of trench warfare. The combination of internal combustion engines, armour plate, track suspension, and synchronized tactics had rendered obsolete the defensive systems that had dominated warfare for 3 years. German generals thought tanks were a joke because early models were unreliable, because early tactics were flawed, because the weapons seemed to contradict established military principles. They were wrong not because they misunderstood the tank's initial limitations, but because they assumed those limitations were permanent. The British continued developing tanks because they understood that mechanical problems could be solved, that tactics could evolve, that initial failures didn't doom a technology. By the time German High Command recognized tanks as a serious threat, it was too late. Germany lacked the industrial capacity, the trained crews, the tactical doctrine, and the time to develop an effective counter. The laughter that German officers had directed at early British tanks died at Cambrai, replaced by fear, respect, and ultimately defeat. The thunder of 476 tank engines rolling across no man's land on that November morning announced not just a new weapon, but a new era of warfare. The trenches that had seemed permanent fixtures of modern battle were crushed beneath steel tracks. The machine guns that had dominated tactics for years were silenced by armour plate. The wire that had stopped millions was pressed flat into mud. In 8 hours, the tactical certainties of 3 years were invalidated. German generals had thought tanks were a joke. At Cambrai, the tanks had the last laugh. The mechanical monsters that emerged from the fog that morning had changed warfare forever. The question was no longer whether tanks could influence battles, but whether any army could survive without them. Germany would spend the next 2 decades answering that question, developing the armoured forces that would dominate the next war's opening years. But on November 20th, 1917, they learned the lesson they had refused to accept through careful analysis. Tanks were not a joke. They were the future of warfare, and the future had arrived in the worst possible way, crushing their defences and shattering their certainties beneath 40 tons of steel and determination. The tactical revolution at Cambrai had immediate ripples beyond the Western Front that German High Command failed to appreciate. While Ludendorff focused on the operational failure, the ultimate British withdrawal from much of their gains, junior German officers who had actually faced the tanks drew very different conclusions. Oberst Hermann von Kuhl, Chief of Staff to Crown Prince Ruprecht, submitted a classified report in January 1918 that would be ignored by senior leadership but carefully studied by younger officers. The report began with a stark assessment. The tank represents a fundamental challenge to our defensive doctrine. Our current anti-tank measures are inadequate. The British will improve their tanks and tactics. We must develop comprehensive countermeasures immediately, or face catastrophic defeats in future operations. Von Kuhl identified specific vulnerabilities in German defensive planning. The reliance on continuous trench lines created predictable defensive zones that tanks could systematically breach. The concentration of defensive firepower in fixed positions made those positions vulnerable to tank assault. The absence of mobile reserves with anti-tank capability meant that once tanks penetrated the forward zone, nothing could stop their advance until they ran out of fuel or broke down. His recommendations were revolutionary for German military thinking. Create defence in depth, with dispersed strongpoints rather than continuous lines. Develop mobile anti-tank units equipped with field guns on motorised carriages. Establish tank traps and obstacles specifically designed to stop tracked vehicles. Most controversially, develop German tank forces capable of counter-attacking enemy armour. The report reached Ludendorff's desk in February 1918 with annotations from multiple staff officers. Most dismissed it as alarmist. One notation, believed to be from Ludendorff himself, read, "We do not have resources to waste on defensive measures against a weapon of limited utility. Our spring offensive will decide the war before tanks become a significant factor. This decision, to prioritise offensive operations over developing anti-tank defences, would have catastrophic consequences." The spring offensive, launched on March 21, 1918, initially validated Ludendorff's confidence. Using infiltration tactics developed on the Eastern Front, German stormtroops achieved breakthrough on a scale that exceeded Cambrai. Without tanks, relying on infantry tactics, artillery preparation and surprise, German forces advanced up to 40 miles in some sectors, threatened Paris, and seemed poised to win the war. But the advance was achieved through human endurance and tactical skill, not mechanical advantage. German infantry, advancing on foot, could only move as fast as men could march while carrying equipment and fighting. Supply lines, dependent on horse-drawn transport over shell-damaged terrain, couldn't keep pace. Artillery, requiring hours to displace forward and register on new targets, lagged behind the advancing infantry. By April, the offensive had created deep salients, but hadn't achieved decisive victory. German forces were exhausted, extended beyond their supply capabilities, and vulnerable to counterattack. Critically, they had no means of exploiting their gains beyond what infantry on foot could achieve. The British and French, falling back on intact rail lines and motorised transport, could reinforce faster than Germans could advance. British tank units pulled from the line during the German offensive were conserved for counterattack. When that counterattack came in August, the contrast between German and Allied capabilities was stark. At Amiens, Allied forces demonstrated tank warfare maturity that didn't exist at Cambrai. The 414 British tanks and 72 French Renault FT light tanks attacked in coordination with aircraft, motorised infantry and cavalry. The German defenders, holding positions they had captured during their spring advance, had no prepared defences optimised for anti-tank warfare. The result was catastrophic. German units that had successfully attacked Allied positions in March collapsed in the face of massed armour in August. Lieutenant Ernst Junger, a stormtroop officer who had participated in the spring offensive and faced British tanks at Amiens, captured the psychological reversal in his memoir, Storm of Steel. In March, we were invincible. We had shattered British lines, advanced further than any offensive since 1914, and seemed destined for victory. In August, we were helpless. The tanks came at us from multiple directions. Our anti-tank rifles, we had perhaps one per company, were useless. The tanks simply crushed our positions, and their supporting infantry mopped up survivors. Men who had fought through years of war, who had never faltered under artillery bombardment or gas attack, broke and ran at the sight of tanks. It wasn't cowardice, it was recognition that we had no means of resistance. The difference between March and August 1918 illustrated the fundamental disparity between German and Allied military evolution. German tactics had evolved within the framework of infantry warfare. Stormtroop infiltration, artillery coordination, and operational planning had all improved, but remained fundamentally dependent on human mobility and endurance. Allied tactics had evolved to incorporate mechanical mobility and firepower. Tanks provided breakthrough capability. Motorized transport maintained supply. Aircraft provided reconnaissance and ground attack. The combination created a system that could sustain operations beyond what purely infantry-based armies could achieve. Major Wilhelm Balck, a staff officer observing the August battles, wrote in his operational diary, "We are watching the emergence of a new form of warfare for which we are completely unprepared. The British are no longer fighting an infantry war supported by tanks. They are fighting a mechanized war in which infantry supports tanks. The psychological and material requirements are completely different. Our soldiers, trained and equipped for infantry combat, cannot adapt to this new reality. The 100 Days Offensive from August to November 1918 saw tanks used in ways that would have been impossible at Cambrai. Mechanical reliability had improved dramatically. The Mark V tank could operate for 12 hours without major breakdown, compared to the Mark I's 4 hours. Crews were better trained, with standardized tactics and improved communication systems. Supply systems had evolved to keep tanks fueled, armed and maintained during sustained operations. Most significantly, combined arms integration had matured. Tank attacks were coordinated with artillery barrages timed to the minute. Aircraft attacked German artillery to suppress anti-tank fire. Infantry followed immediately behind tanks to consolidate captured positions. Engineers accompanied attacks to clear obstacles and repair tanks. The result was an operational system that could maintain offensive pressure continuously, something no purely infantry force could achieve. German forces, lacking equivalent systems, fought a series of delaying actions. Some units fought with extraordinary tenacity, holding positions until overrun. Others collapsed immediately at the appearance of tanks. The variance in performance reflected not differences in courage but differences in tactical situation. Units with prepared anti-tank defences, artillery support and favourable terrain could exact heavy tolls on attacking tanks. Units caught in open ground with inadequate anti-tank weapons surrendered en masse. By September 1918, German defensive doctrine had effectively collapsed. The careful tactical systems developed through years of warfare, defensive zones, machine gun positions, artillery coordination, assumed enemies who had to advance on foot through predictable kill zones. Tanks violated these assumptions, creating mobility and protection that existing defensive systems couldn't counter. Oberst Max Bauer, an artillery specialist who had helped develop German defensive doctrine, admitted in a September 1918 staff conference, "We designed our defences to stop infantry. They work brilliantly against infantry, but tanks aren't infantry. They don't take cover, they don't need to pause to cut wire, they don't require perfect artillery support to advance. Our defensive systems are optimised for an enemy that no longer exists." The October 1918 breaching of the Hindenburg Line, the defensive system that had stopped every Allied attack from 1916 through early 1918, demonstrated how completely German defensive advantages had evaporated. British and American forces, supported by hundreds of tanks, broke through the Hindenburg Line in 4 days. The defences that had seemed impregnable at Cambrai in 1917 were systematically dismantled by improved tanks and tactics in 1918. German combat reports from October reveal the psychological collapse. Unit after unit reported that their positions were strong, their soldiers determined, and their weapons functional, but that tanks rendered all these factors irrelevant. Defensive positions designed to withstand artillery bombardment were vulnerable to direct tank assault. Machine guns that could stop infantry attacks were useless against armour. Artillery, the ultimate arbiter of Western Front warfare, was suppressed by counter-battery fire and air attack before tanks even appeared. Hauptmann Rudolf Binding, commanding an infantry battalion in the Hindenburg Line, wrote on October 8, 1918, "We have excellent positions, good fields of fire, adequate ammunition, and soldiers who have not lost their courage. But when tanks appear, none of this matters. The tanks crush our wire, cross our trenches, suppress our bunkers with point-blank fire, and their infantry follows in safety. We can kill the infantry if we survive the tanks, but surviving the tanks requires weapons we don't have. Yesterday, my battalion of 600 men held a sector against infantry attack for 6 hours, inflicting heavy casualties. Today, 6 tanks breached our position in 30 minutes. We had no means of resistance." The armistice of November 11, 1918 ended the fighting before the full implications of tank warfare could be realised. British plans for 1919 included operations with thousands of tanks, deep penetration offensives aimed at destroying German armies rather than capturing territory, and combined arms operations that would have resembled World War II armoured warfare. German plans for 1919, to the extent they existed, focused on defensive operations with inadequate means to stop massed armour. The post-war analysis conducted by military professionals on both sides reached consensus on several points. Tanks had proven decisive in breaking trench warfare stalemate. Mechanical reliability and tactical employment had improved faster than defences could adapt. Future warfare would be dominated by mechanised forces. Armies that failed to develop armoured capabilities would be at catastrophic disadvantage. But the interpretation of these lessons diverged dramatically. The British, having developed and employed tanks successfully, drew conclusions focused on the limitations they had experienced. Tanks required extensive support infrastructure. Combined arms cooperation was essential but difficult to coordinate. Mechanical reliability, while improved, remained problematic. Tank forces were expensive to develop and maintain. These observations, all accurate, led to British force structure decisions in the 1920s and 1930s that would prove inadequate. Tank development continued, but at modest pace. Armoured doctrine remained conservative, viewing tanks as infantry support rather than independent striking forces. Investment in tank forces was constrained by budget limitations and competing priorities. The French, who had employed tanks alongside the British and developed excellent light tanks like the Renault FT, drew similar conclusions. Tanks were important, but not dominant weapons. Future warfare would be defensive, with tanks supporting infantry in carefully planned operations. The Maginot Line, with its emphasis on prepared defences and firepower over mobility, reflected these assumptions. The Germans, having lost the war partly due to their failure to develop effective armoured forces, drew more radical conclusions. The junior officers who had faced British tanks, including Heinz Guderian, Ernst Volkheim, and Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, became advocates for mechanised warfare that went far beyond what the Allies envisioned. Their analysis started from a different premise. Germany had lost World War I because industrial and demographic disadvantages made attrition warfare unwinnable. Future German success required warfare that avoided attrition, achieved rapid decision, and exploited mobility to offset material disadvantages. Tanks, properly employed, offered exactly these capabilities. Guderian's writings in the 1920s and 1930s developed a theory of armoured warfare that synthesized British tactical experience with German operational concepts. Tanks should be concentrated in armoured divisions, not dispersed as infantry support. Armoured divisions should operate independently, seeking breakthrough and deep penetration. Supporting arms, infantry, artillery, engineers should be mechanised to keep pace with tanks. Air power should be integrated to provide reconnaissance and suppress enemy resistance. Most radically, Guderian argued that tanks should be the decision weapon, with other arms supporting them, reversing the traditional hierarchy where infantry dominated and other arms supported. This concept, revolutionary in the 1920s, would become German doctrine in the 1930s. The panzer divisions created in 1935 incorporated these principles, creating balanced combined arms forces centred on tanks. The Treaty of Versailles, which prohibited German tank development, ironically accelerated German armoured doctrine development. Unable to build tanks, German officers focused on theory, studying foreign tank developments, analysing World War I tank battles, and developing tactical concepts in detail. Secret cooperation with the Soviet Union provided training opportunities and practical experience that would have been impossible within Germany. When German rearmament began in earnest in 1933, the doctrinal foundation for armoured warfare was more sophisticated than anything the Allies possessed. The panzer divisions were designed from inception as instruments of mobile warfare, capable of independent operations, deep penetration, and exploitation. British and French tanks, by contrast, remained tied to infantry support roles, with inadequate mobility, communication, and combined arms integration for independent operations. The irony was complete. The nation that had dismissed tanks as impractical in 1917, that had lost partially due to failure to develop armoured forces, became the world's leading practitioner of armoured warfare by 1939. The nations that had developed and employed tanks successfully in 1918 allowed their armoured capabilities to atrophy, pursuing conservative doctrines that negated the revolutionary potential of mechanised warfare. When German panzers attacked Poland in September 1939, they employed tactics that were direct descendants of the British tank attacks at Cambrai and Amiens. Concentration of force, surprise, combined arms integration, deep penetration, maintenance of momentum. The execution was more sophisticated, the technology more advanced, but the fundamental concepts were those developed by British tank pioneers in 1917 and 1918. The Polish army, equipped with anti-tank weapons superior to those available to German forces in 1918, fought bravely but couldn't stop the Panzer advance. The psychological shock that Polish soldiers experienced, facing massed armour supported by dive bombers, paralleled what German soldiers had felt at Cambrai. When German forces attacked France in May 1940, the results were even more shocking. French and British forces, with more tanks and often superior tank designs, were decisively defeated. The difference wasn't material, but doctrinal. German armoured divisions operated as mobile strike forces, seeking breakthrough and exploitation. Allied tanks, dispersed in infantry support roles, couldn't concentrate for decisive counterattack. The Battle of France validated every lesson German officers had learned from their World War I defeat. Avoid attrition warfare, concentrate mechanised forces, achieve breakthrough through combined arms operations, exploit ruthlessly to prevent enemy stabilisation. The tactics that British tanks had pioneered at Cambrai had been perfected by the Germans and turned against their inventors. French and British soldiers in 1940, experiencing what German soldiers had experienced in 1918, discovered that preparation and courage meant nothing when facing an enemy with superior operational doctrine. The defences that seemed adequate against infantry attacks collapsed before coordinated armoured assault. The psychological impact was identical to what German forces had suffered: paralysis, confusion, and collapse in the face of enemy capabilities that existing doctrine couldn't counter. General Alan Brooke, commanding British forces during the Dunkirk evacuation, wrote in his diary, "The Germans have developed a form of warfare for which we are completely unprepared. Their armoured divisions don't support attacks, they are the attack. Their combination of tanks, motorised infantry, artillery and air power creates a system we cannot counter with our current organisation. We are experiencing what the Germans experienced in 1918, rendered obsolete by our enemy's superior understanding of mechanised warfare." The ultimate irony came in 1944 and 1945, when British and American forces, having relearned the lessons their predecessors had pioneered, employed armoured warfare doctrine against Germany that was descended from German innovations that were descended from British innovations. The cycle was complete. The breakthrough battles in Normandy in 1944 employed tactics recognisable to veterans of Cambrai: massed armour concentrations, surprise attacks, combined arms integration, deep penetration. The technology was a generation advanced, with more reliable tanks, better communication, air superiority. But the fundamental concepts remained those established in 1917 and 1918. German forces in 1944, facing Allied armoured superiority, experienced what British and French forces had experienced in their defeats. Defensive positions, however strong, were bypassed or suppressed. Anti-tank weapons, however capable, were overwhelmed by numbers. Tactical skill and operational experience couldn't overcome material disadvantage and doctrinal inadequacy. The German generals who had learned armoured warfare from studying their World War I defeats found themselves defeated by enemies who had relearned what German generals had learned from studying British successes. The question of why German High Command in 1917 dismissed tanks despite mounting evidence of their potential has occupied military historians for decades. The answer is complex, involving institutional conservatism, resource constraints, and cognitive biases that affect all military organisations. The institutional conservatism was real and powerful. The German army of 1917 was among the most professional military organisations ever created, with sophisticated training, rigorous doctrine development, and demonstrated tactical excellence. This excellence created confidence in existing methods and scepticism toward innovations that contradicted established principles. Tanks violated fundamental principles of German military thinking. They were slow, reducing operational tempo. They were mechanically unreliable, creating dependence on logistics. They were expensive, consuming resources needed for proven weapons. They required specialized training, disrupting established personnel systems. Most fundamentally, they suggested that firepower and protection could substitute for tactical skill and operational excellence, an idea German officers found philosophically objectionable. The resource constraints were equally real. Germany in 1917 faced steel shortages, fuel shortages, and industrial capacity constraints that made large-scale tank production difficult even if leadership had prioritized it. Every ton of steel allocated to tanks was steel not available for artillery, machine guns, or submarines. The rational calculation, given limited resources, was to invest in proven weapons rather than experimental ones. The cognitive biases were perhaps most significant. Having identified genuine problems with early tank designs and tactics, German analysts generalized these specific problems into fundamental limitations. This is a common analytical error, assuming that current limitations are permanent rather than temporary. The British made the same error in reverse during the 1920s and 1930s, assuming that the successes they achieved with tanks in 1918 represented the ultimate potential of armoured warfare, rather than early steps in ongoing evolution. But beyond these factors was a deeper issue that affected all military organisations in the early 20th century. The difficulty of recognising revolutionary change while it's occurring. Cambrai didn't look revolutionary at the time because the operational outcome was British withdrawal from most captured territory. The revolutionary aspect, the unprecedented speed of initial breakthrough, and the collapse of defences considered impregnable, was obscured by the ultimate failure to achieve strategic victory. Military organisations are optimised to learn from defeat more than success. The Germans learned extensively from their defeats in 1918, leading to innovative doctrine in the interwar period. The British and French learned less from their victories, leading to doctrinal stagnation. This pattern recurs throughout military history. Success breeds complacency. Defeat breeds innovation. The German army of 1917, undefeated on the Eastern Front and confident in Western Front defensive capabilities, had little incentive to embrace revolutionary change. The German army of 1919, defeated and restricted by treaty, had every incentive to develop innovative solutions to material disadvantage. The generals who dismissed tanks in 1917 weren't stupid or blind. They were experienced professionals making reasonable judgments based on available evidence. Their error was assuming that current evidence represented permanent reality rather than temporary conditions subject to change. The tanks of 1917 were indeed slow, unreliable, and tactically limited. But the tanks of 1918 were markedly improved, and the tanks of 1939 were revolutionary. The defensive systems of 1917 could indeed stop tank attacks under many conditions, but defensive evolution couldn't keep pace with offensive innovation, leaving defences optimised for 1917 conditions vulnerable to 1918 capabilities. The tragedy for Germany was that their generals' reasonable judgments in 1917, based on accurate assessment of then-current conditions, led to strategic decisions that proved catastrophic by 1918. The failure to invest in tank development, anti-tank defences, and revised doctrine meant that when Allied armoured capabilities matured, German forces had no effective response. This pattern, reasonable judgments based on current conditions leading to strategic failure when conditions change, represents one of the fundamental challenges of military planning. Preparing for future war requires balancing investment in proven capabilities against development of potentially revolutionary innovations. Over-investing in proven systems risks obsolescence. Over-investing in unproven innovations risks wasting scarce resources. The British in 1917 made the correct choice, continuing tank development despite early failures. The Germans made the incorrect choice, abandoning tank development after assessing early results. But this judgment is only clear in retrospect. At the time, German decision-making appeared rational, while British persistence seemed wasteful. The Battle of Cambrai and its aftermath represent a case study in military innovation under pressure. The British, facing an apparently insoluble tactical problem, invested in unproven technology and radical tactical concepts. The Germans, confident in established methods, dismissed innovation as unnecessary. The British approach involved enormous costs in failed experiments, wasted resources, and tactical defeats. The German approach appeared efficient, focusing resources on proven capabilities. But the long-term results vindicated the British approach. By continuing to develop tanks despite failures, by refining tactics through painful experience, by maintaining institutional commitment to innovation, the British created a weapon that contributed significantly to Allied victory. The German approach, rational and efficient in the short term, left German forces vulnerable to capabilities they couldn't counter. The lesson isn't that innovation always succeeds, or that conservatism always fails. Many innovations fail, and many traditional methods remain effective. The lesson is that military organizations must maintain capacity for innovation even when current methods appear adequate. The organization that cannot adapt to revolutionary change, that cannot recognize when fundamental conditions have shifted, will eventually face an enemy that has adapted, with catastrophic results. German generals thought tanks were a joke until those tanks crushed the trenches at Cambrai. By the time they recognized their error, correcting it was impossible within the time available. The industrial capacity, trained personnel, doctrinal development, and tactical experience required for effective armoured warfare required years to develop. Germany didn't have years. The result was defeat in 1918, followed by 2 decades of doctrinal development that would briefly give Germany superiority in armoured warfare, followed by defeat in 1945 when enemies with greater industrial capacity adopted the innovations German officers had developed from studying their earlier defeat. The cycle of innovation, adoption, diffusion, and counter-innovation continues in military affairs. The specific technologies change, tanks to missiles to drones to cyber weapons, but the fundamental pattern remains. Revolutionary innovations initially appear impractical, expensive, and inferior to established methods. Organizations that persist in developing innovations despite early failures eventually create capabilities that render existing defenses obsolete. Organizations that dismiss innovations based on early performance find themselves facing enemies with capabilities they cannot counter. The tanks that emerged from the fog at Cambrai on November 20th, 1917, represented not just a new weapon, but a new era. The generals who laughed learned too late that the future doesn't wait for those who refuse to recognize it. By the time the laughter stopped, the thunder of tank engines had already announced that warfare would never be the same.